State University. He was founder and director of the Patterson Archives at Westfield State, founder of the Blair Archives at the Westfield Athenaeum, local historian, lecturer, and Edwin Smith Historical Museum docent. Bob was the go-to man for any historical question. If you enjoy tonight's lecture, he's also going to be speaking for the Western Hampden Historical Society on May 21st. And there's handouts both in the front and in the back here. If you'd like to come, just take one of those home with you. And thank you again for coming.
Got to make sure everything is wired up. I'm wired up on all sides here. Are we? Okay, I guess we're go. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We've got another nice big crowd. There's some business that I've got to take care of first. And first of all, particularly I want to give thanks to Bruce Cordes. I'm technologically incompetent, and I could not possibly do any of these talks of recently without the technical aid of Bruce. And, of course, all of the talks are based on material that I've gotten from the Westfield Library, the Westfield Athenaeum, which is a wonderful source. Finally, I'd like to thank the 350th Committee for having me give the opening talk and the closing talk. Particularly, I want to thank Vanessa Diana and Cindy Gaylord and Joyce Peregrine, who set these talks up. I'll tell you, I think these 13 talks have been a wonderful thing in the city. I've been here. I've been here a little over 50 years. I'm not native, but I've been here a little over 50 years, and I don't think I have ever seen as much community support for anything as I've seen over this last 6 months for what the 350th Committee has put together. So I particularly want to thank you, the people of Westfield, who've come out in full force for all of this. The title of this topic is, in many ways, Things Change. And the reality is there's change going on all the time. I'm not one of those people who digs my heels in and says, you know, we've got to stop this. Why can't we go back to the way things were? We've got to preserve because it used to be. Things change. That's a reality of life. I think what's important is that we don't really recognize how much things change because most change is incremental. It's slow. It happens when we're not really paying attention. And it's only after a lot of time has gone by that we're suddenly aware just how much change has taken place. And it's one thing that photographs will do. Photographs provide or revive our memory. And it's only in looking at these photographs that we sometimes realize just how drastically things have changed. But the problem with photographic memory is it's really only good if the photographs survive. And we're quite lucky in that the library has accumulated hundreds, and in more modern terms, thousands of photographs that show Westfield as it has existed over the last 150 years. And you can, through these photographs, see the past. Now, I'm going to talk about a group of homes tonight that share some unique characteristics. Once upon a time, before the advent of the automobile and mass transportation, you had to live within walking distance of your work. What that meant is that even if you were one of the wealthier citizens in the community, your home was still in the central, what we would call the central business district. you tended to have a home very near your factory or your office or your bank or your law office. These homes were big and imposing. Just they represented your status in the community, and they were big and imposing, and they were wonderful homes quite often. But with the passage of time and the growth of communities, suddenly people who were a little better off, who could keep those homes up, who could pay to heat them, who could fix the roofs on them, they didn't want to live next door to the factory. They didn't want to live next door to the little homes of the workers. They wanted to live with more space in more manageable properties. And so the homes became forgotten and to deteriorate. And so the homes I'm going to talk about are homes that once were magnificent, then became derelict, and one way or another, they've all disappeared. So none of these homes survive anymore in the city. Secondly, because the homes are old, most of these homes were built somewhere between 1750 and 1850. No one was going around writing down records of, well, today we built this home and the architect was, and it cost this much money. And that's even more true of when they disappeared. By the time they disappeared, most of them were derelict, and no one was writing newspaper stories about, oh, isn't it a shame that this wonderful home once disappeared? That happened very rarely. So much of what I'm going to give you for dates about the comings and going of these homes are close approximations rather than absolute fact. Now, with that in mind, let's start. This is what started my whole project, because this home is so unusual. It had pillars all around it, well, on three sides. You can see it is brick. It is, I keep fading out here. It's brick. It is Greek Revival, but it's a style you don't see in New England because of the pillars around three sides. It's more commonly seen in Louisiana in a plantation, or South Carolina in a plantation home. I have no idea who built it. It appears in the record for the first time about 1830. And I was kind of interested in that because that's roughly the same time as the old City Hall was built next door. And the old City Hall has a feature that's very unusual also, those brick pillars in the front, which are commonly seen only in the Caribbean or occasionally in South Carolina. And so I kind of wondered if maybe we've got a builder with some connections to the South in that era for some reason. Anyway, this is the Deacon Chadwick home. He was a merchant here in town. He was living in it in the 1830s, and the home disappeared somewhere just prior to World War I. I know that in 1919, there was a garage on this site. Now, if this doesn't quite ring a bell, this is what's on the site today. Next one, please. Next one, please. Now, this is one of the very early homes. This is probably 1760s. It's a center chimney. They call it Georgian. Those of you who know the Dewey House or the Fowler Tavern, this is in that style of mid-18th century home. This is the Mosely House, built, as I said, about 1760s. In 1900, this house was moved it was pulled back on this site, back a couple of hundred feet, and there it survived until 1951, when it was torn down. It's the corner of Coleman Avenue, and this is where it sat for almost 200 years. Now, everyone, I think, knows the story of the Fowler Tavern door, which was taken off and taken to the Metropolitan Museum. If you notice on this house, it had the same kind of door. And it also was taken off in the 1930s. But there doesn't seem to be any record of what happened to it. Certainly nobody preserved it for the future. This again is a 18th century house, about 1770. This is the Richard Falley house. It sat on Court Street. After Richard Falley left the home, it then became the home of Dr. Atwater. And after that, it became the home of James Holland, Dr. James Holland. And if you can make out the figure right there, he's got a big top hat. That's Dr. James himself standing right there. This was a magnificent home that lasted until 1875. But then the Methodists decided they needed a new church. And this is where the Methodists built their church. And so this home, again, was pulled back on the site, and it became Holland Avenue. And the home lasted until 1929, when there was an expansion of the Methodist Church property, and they tore the home down in 1929. Today, it is the site of the modern Methodist Church, which replaced the great historic structure that had stood there. Next one. This is another 18th century home. The date usually given on this one is 1756. This was the Douglas home. The daughter of the family is the first wife of James Fowler, the man whose home became the library. This is the grandmother of Lucy Gillett. She was Lucy Douglas Gillett. The Douglas home is like so many homes in the 18th century. It's not terribly unique that way. I know it lasted up to the early 1930s. When it disappeared, I don't know, but it was still there in the early 1930s. Now, I want to keep this one in sight, and the only reason I use this home is because of right there. Now, some of you may be able to see these white spots right here. That's the canal. That's the only photograph which exists that shows the canal. It ran in the front of the house. Now, if you'll put up the next one, please. This is not the location of the house. This is an error I took. It should be, the picture that should be there should be TD Bank, which is on the other side of the street. That's where the Douglas house was. This was the site of Hiram Harrison's house, who also had a home very much like that, but it had a big cupola on the top. And that's a home that we don't have a photograph of. We've got a number of photographs that show the top of it, that show the cupola peeking over the railroad tracks. So this is one of the homes that I must say the Cordes family said, you've got your house turned around wrong. You've got the wrong picture. So we'll go on to the next one. Probably, this was the site of the oldest home in Westfield. In 1670, Joseph Whiting came to town to open the first, some people like to call it a trading post, store, building that goods could be purchased in. He had a Connecticut builder by the name of Joseph Mosely build him a little building. And a few years later, he sold the property to Joseph Mosely, who then built a house there. This house is that house. It may have been built 1700, 1720, somewhere in there. Over the years, Joseph Mosely's name got changed to Joseph Mosely, and that's the Mosely family in Westfield, but it was originally Mosely. In the 1930s, the Historical Society, investigating this house, decided to preserve the small attached L on the back, which everyone believed was the original 1670 building. And so they took it down and they stored all the timbers in various properties around town. Those timbers continued to exist through the 1960s. I have lost track of them, but that probably was the oldest structure. This property continued to exist until 2005, when it was torn down and replaced with the Meeting House condominiums. But this corner was the site of the second Congregational Church, the first school, and probably the oldest standing structure in Westfield. Now, I assume many of you recognize this one. This again is a 1760s, 1770s home. They said the dates get very unclear. This home I've included in part because it was occupied by many prominent people in town. Probably the house was built by the Sackett family, who's one of the families that are original settlers. In time, the house was occupied by the Bingham family, and Bingham was the proprietor of the Park Square Hotel in the 19th century, for many years in the 19th century. So a fairly prominent businessman in town. The next owner was Coleman, and Coleman was the photographer in town for the late 19th century. He's responsible for many of the best photographs that we have in town. And finally, at the end of the 19th century, Kittredge took it, and Kittredge was the principal of the high school for the first 3 decades of the 20th century. So this is the Sackett, Bingham, Coleman, Kittredge house. Most people know it better as the Kittredge house. This house survived until 2003. And I won't go into it, but I think you all know that it was a very controversial action when this house disappeared. The doorway has survived, but the rest of the house is gone and exists only in memory. Now, this is one of the Greek Revival houses in town, built probably in the 1830s, 1840s. I should mention here that rumor has it, and it's probably true, that all of these houses with pillars in town, and by the way, there were a number of them, most of them are gone. Probably the best known survival is the so-called Douglas Clinic on Court Street. But all of these are ascribed to a single builder, Chauncey Shepherd, who is the grandson of General William Shepherd. He lived in Springfield. He was a builder. We would use the fancy name architect for him. In those days, I doubt they did. He was a builder, and he was famous for building these Greek Revival homes. Now, this particular home was the original home of Hiram Hull, who's one of the two biggest names associated with the early Westfield whip industry. I'm sure those of you who came to Bruce Cordes' talk know about Hiram Hull and Hiram Harrison. This one was the original home of Hiram Hull. He built a new home on School Street. He built it right where the old original Advent church was. You probably remember it better as Piper's Dry Cleaners on School Street. That was the original Advent church. And that's where his home for most of his life was. Hiram Hull is famous in a lot of ways in this city, in ways that perhaps the other whip makers aren't, because Hiram Hull was a revolutionary in a lot of ways. He's one of the founders of the Methodist Church in town, and the Methodists in those days were great revolutionaries. They were temperance people, they were women's rights people, they were abolitionists, and Hiram Hull is probably the only person in town that can really be identified as associated with the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. Perhaps the most famous story about Hiram Hull and his rather liberal ideas was that the Irish began to flow into town with the building of the railroad, and they ultimately wanted a church, and they started work on what would become St. Mary's, and the good Protestant Yankee citizens of Westfield were not about to let that happen in their town, and a mob gathered to burn the church down. Hiram Hull is reputed to have gone down to the church, stood in front of the mob, and essentially said things like, "I know you, and you're one of my employees, and you're one of my employees, and I know you, and if you don't go home now, nobody is employed tomorrow." And the mob left, and the Catholic Church grew. Hiram Hull. Now this house was one of 3 historic houses in a row on Franklin Street. In 1957, they were all torn down, and this is what we have in its place. Now, this was not a private home at all. This actually is a tavern. It appears in the record the first time in 1816. I don't know when it was built, but I know it was in existence in 1816. It's called the Hampden House or Gad Palmer's Tavern. It sat on what would be the north end of the green, the north side of the green on Main Street. It wasn't as famous as the Woronoco House or a few others, but it did a lively business in town until this church got too crowded. And they decided that the congregation would have to be split and they would have to build a second church. And so directly across the street over there sat the tavern, and that was the site that the good fathers decided to build the second congregational church. So as was most common in the 18th and 19th centuries, unlike today, they didn't tear buildings down. If you don't have plumbing or electric wires or sewer hookups, and you don't have tractor trailers on the street, it's real easy to jack a building up on its foundation, get yourself a couple of teams of oxen, throw a chain around the building, and move it. And so they pulled this building straight back about, 250 feet. And it lasted for a few years as a tavern, a hotel, and then it became a tenement house. And it gradually deteriorated, and finally in 1934, they tore it down. There's the Thomas Street parking lot behind Hearns, where it sat until 1934. Here's another one of Chauncey Smith's beautiful L-shaped. He usually made them L-shaped. The L-shaped Greek Revival pillared houses. This is the Reuben Smith home on Court Street. Again, probably built 1830, 1840. Reuben Smith is a rather mysterious character. I've been able to find very little about him, and the few things I find out about him, people are very hesitant. The rumor is that he was a professional gambler. He's called Razor Smith because his reputation as a man who cut the edges off silver and gold coins, they used to call it clipped coins. He has, in the records, he's got a rather disreputable reputation, but he obviously had money. He built a very large and a beautiful home. In 1890, the normal school building on Washington Street gave up the ghost. It was in terrible shape. There was an open sewer that ran through the basement. They had put wings on it at one time, and the wings leaked continuously. The third floor had no windows in it, and in the days of kerosene lamps and candles, you had to have lights in it during the daytime. There was a cupola on the roof that leaked continuously. It was a mess. And so finally, in 1890, the Commonwealth agreed that it would build a new normal school, and they built it on Court Street. Right there is where Reuben Smith's home was. However, this story is different. Yes, they moved Reuben Smith's home, but they did something unusual. If you would back up just a moment, please. What they did is they cut the house in half, right there. And they made two houses. And they moved two houses. And those two houses survive today. You go up Court Street just a little bit further, and on your left is Cortez Street. And if you turn down that little Cortez Street, which runs at the base of the hill behind the hospital, right at the head of Court Street, those two halves sit side by side. They're still there, but they're two separate houses. Okay. This is another one of those, remember I told you there were three historic houses on Franklin Street? Well, this is the second of those homes. This is a brick federal house. It means it's built probably around 1820. Federal houses are easily identifiable. The narrow part of the house faces the street. You go in the front door from the narrow part of the house. This sat next to that Chauncey Shepherd home. This was the Kellogg house, occupied by the Kellogg family for many, many years. And again, 1957, torn down, and today, what was there, what they placed originally was the A&P. Those of you who've been in town a few years will remember the A&P was there originally, and that's what they replaced it with. All right. Now, lots of you will remember this home. I'm sorry that we do not have a decent picture of this house in its prime. We only have pictures of its house at the end. Now, this was the Reuben Noble house. It was built in 1878 on property that had been in the hands of the family since the original division of lands in the 1670s. There had not been a house previous to this on this property. This was the first house on this property. Reuben, by this time, is a very prosperous farmer, banker, whip manufacturer, and a whole lot of other things. He married a very unusual woman, Annette Noble. Very unusual because she was a doctor. She was an MD. I do not know if she practiced medicine after she married. I do not know whether she did or not. My guess is that she probably didn't. But this is the money for Noble Hospital. And they had a single child, Mary, who a number of you probably remember. Mary also was an unusual woman. She was an attorney. And Mary was very, very active in the community. She lived here until her death. Unfortunately, she did not follow that rule that says no attorney should ever represent themselves. She made a number of generous bequests in her will, and most of them ran into complications. She bequeathed this home and its outlying property to the city to be used for the benefit of the senior citizens of Westfield. Perhaps she thought that this house could be converted to their use, and she wasn't thinking about all the rules and regulations which exist today about handicapped access and all the rest of the problems. To be quite honest with you, the city didn't know what to do with the building. And so the city let it go derelict. I live just around the corner from it, and the roof went and pigeons began to flow in and out, and I went down to various city officials and said, my wife wasn't happy, but I said, I might be interested in buying this property. You know, I just save it. I love this property. Oh no, it's going to be reserved for senior citizens. Vagrants began to break in, and finally in 1997, vagrants set fire to it. The property, not the house, but the property ultimately did go to good use. It became the Westfield Senior Citizens House property. But the house is gone. Here's another one of Westfield's fine brick mansions. We have many of these mansard roof mansions. They're easily identifiable, and you can easily identifiable the approximate date of building. The mansard roof is a French invention. It's most commonly associated with the French Second Empire, Louis Napoleon III, 1860s and 70s. That's when these homes were largely constructed. Westfield has a great number of them. Some of them have been restored. There's a one on East Bartlett Street that is a tenement that is falling to pieces, that in its day was a magnificent whipmaker's home. This is the Major Bush house. No, I don't know why he was called Major. This home was built in the 1870s. You can see it's brick, it's big, it's imposing. It replaced an earlier house on this site, the house of Pliny Mosely. I've never seen a picture of it. I don't think any picture ever exists, but I mention that because Pliny Mosely, who was very active in the church here, had a daughter. The daughter's name was Sybil. And a number of you have heard me talk about Sybil Mosely, who married Hiram Bingham, and the pair went off to Hawaii in 1819 and are the foundation of the mission movement in Hawaii. For those of you of a certain age who remember that old movie Hawaii, Julie Andrews played Sybil Mosely in the movie. This was the site of their house. This house was torn down in 1960. And this apartment building replaces it. Now there are 3 apartment buildings on Broad Street that replaced 18th and early 19th century homes. There's Security Manor, the Forum House, and I don't believe this one has a name, but it's just on the corner of Bush Street. By the way, since it looks like I'm moving along fairly quickly, let me tell you another piece of information about this site that you don't really need, but why not? On this other corner, right over here, is another small brick home. If you were to go down on that corner and stop there and look at the back end of that brick home, do you notice that at the end of it there is a brick end, that the bricks are a different color, and that it has a strange set of windows right up under the eaves of the roof? That's the original schoolhouse for the center of Westfield. It used to sit on the other side of the street. It was moved over there and they built a brick home around it. But that's the original schoolhouse. This is the Horton home on Broad Street, built about 1870. You can see it's a mansard roof house also. It replaced an earlier home. This one did not last very long. It was built in 1870, torn down about 1910. Well, a very important person came along and wanted something else. This is Governor Joe Ely's house that replaced it. He wasn't governor then. He was just a very prominent corporate attorney whose father was even a more prominent corporate attorney, whose grandfather was also a fairly prominent corporate attorney. And obviously by that time, one wanted the home you wanted. And so he built this home around 1910, lived in it for a few years. In 1958, this home was turned over to a home for elderly who needed care. This became ultimately the Governor's Center. I'm told that the only surviving part of the governor's home is in the kitchen in the basement, and that one wall remains from the original house. When I came to town, the nursing home was there, but you could still see the house. It still looked like the governor's house. This reconstruction was done, I believe, in the late 1970s or early 1980s, when the governor's house disappeared completely. Westfield actually built 3 of these things. I have no idea why. I know they were a fad for a brief period in time in American history. There are books about the octagon houses in America. One survives on King Street. This one was built by Mary Rood, and I have no idea who she was or why she built it, in 1865. She apparently never occupied the house. It was bought almost immediately by H.B. Smith. And what he did is he added this she only had 2 stories. He added this 3rd-story mansard roof and cupola, and then he added these porches, and he particularly added this H.B. Smith ironworks. I'm going to show you a few houses, and if you looked at the pictures up front, you saw a couple of more. That ironwork was very, very common in Westfield for a long period of time. This church has numerous parts of it made of H.B. Smith iron. There were numerous other owners over the years, and in 1949, it burned down. Now, there is a little survival of it because the ironwork did not burn. And a man by the name of Harry Belden, who owned the Belden Inn on Russell Road, some of you may know it as the Sheraton Inn, but originally it was the Belden Inn. Harry Belden saved the ironwork, and he took it to another house that he owned on Franklin Street. If you go out Franklin Street, just past the armory where the road bends, on the right-hand side is a small, relatively nondescript house with a porch with this ironwork on it. It is the remains of this octagon house. And of course, the house sat right there. Okay. This is probably a Civil War era. Again, you see the mansard roof that pretty much dates it, 1860s, 1870s. This was built by the Loomis family. After a few years, it was occupied by the Keep family. Now, that's a name that has disappeared in Westfield. And I think it's terribly unfortunate because people have totally forgotten that when the Noble family gave the money to build Noble Hospital, that was for surgical cases only. In fact, part of the will said that no contagious disease patients were allowed in the hospital. So Mrs. Keep, who was a widow at that point in time, she donated money to build a second hospital that sat right beside the Noble Hospital. It was the Keep Memorial Hospital. That was a hospital for contagious patients, and it was also a nurses' training hospital. Ultimately, the two were blended together, and it all became called Noble Hospital, and people forgot Mary Keep entirely. Now, the most famous owner was the next owner, Robert Parks. Parks, in some ways, is rather a nefarious person in town also, involved in a great scandal over the collapse of an insurance industry in town. Everybody else lost their money. Somehow he ended up rich. He used his money to build a massive commercial property on Main Street. It was called the Parks Building, but many of you may remember it by its later name, the Professional Building. That was his, the famous Professional Building fire. Robert Parks lived here on Elm Street, yeah. Robert Parks lived here until his death. His last few years were tragic because he believed, and probably quite rightly, that there were people out to get him. Lights burned in the house day and night. He had an armed bodyguard who was with him the last few years of his life. Numerous fires were set in his property, including his outbuildings. But this was the Parks house, and finally it was torn down in 1927 and replaced with this apartment block, which is next to the YMCA. This is another one of the Broad Street houses. It was built by the Jessup family in the 1850s. And then when the Elys decided to move onto Broad Street, Henry Ely, the father of Joseph, and as I said, at that point in time, Henry was the big corporation lawyer at that point in time. Henry bought this property and totally rebuilt it. This is the picture about 1913 when it has been rebuilt under Henry Ely's construction. It was turned around. It had a big horse barn behind it. In 1947, this was torn down, and the property stayed vacant for about 10 years. And in 1957, the congregation of St. John's Lutheran purchased the property and built their church. Now, the barn survived for a short period. I have pictures of the construction of this church, or I've seen pictures of the construction of this church, and the barn is out in that big parking lot behind it. The barn survived for quite a while. Okay. I'm sure many of you recognize this house. This again is a Broad Street home. This was the Lamberton home, built in 1875. Shortly after it was built, it caught fire. Now, that tower was originally square. And when they rebuilt the house, they rebuilt it as a round tower. Lamberton died not long after the house was built. It then was occupied by Warren of Warren Thread. And ultimately, in more modern times, the Marth family lived there. This home is reputed to be the first home in Westfield that had a full, modern, flush toilet and running hot and cold water. It is today the parking lot for EB Bank. It was raised in 2006. Those of you of a certain age may recognize this one. This is the Lucy Gillett home. The home was built in 1853. It was built by her father. Her father and mother lived in their in-laws' home. Their in-law was James Fowler. That is the boys and girls section of the children's library. Her older brother was born in the upstairs bedroom, which is today the Whitney study. And obviously they didn't want to live with their in-laws all that long, and so the father-in-law gave him a piece of the garden. This was the garden next door. And Edward Bates Gillett built this home for his family. His daughter Lucy continued to live there until her death. And in 1951, this building was torn down, and the Woronoco Savings Bank, today Berkshire Bank, went on that property. This is a Queen Anne American Gothic. It's one of two houses that shared Court Street. There were two of them, built within 2 years of each other. This one probably was built first, 1874. Its companion was built 1875 or 76. This is the Bush Miller home. Miller was a major official in U.S. whip. A huge, old, rambling Victorian, the kind of thing that California has made famous by, and many other communities in America, by painting the modern colors, and they're glorious examples in the town. The trouble is, they're horrible to heat, horribly expensive to keep up. There are various problems with it. And so in 1952, this was torn down. Now, in its last 27 years of existence, it had not been a private home. It had been a church. This was the Church of Atonement, and for 27 years, they held services in that building. And then in 1952, built this. Now, in this picture, no, they're gone in this picture. Those of you may remember that there were three little brick structures. They were called the Three Little Pigs when I came to town. Well, that's where the other of those giant homes sat. Remember back half an hour ago, I talked about the Falley, Atwater, Holland house on Court Street, and the Methodist Church. Holland had to have a new house. And so he built a companion one right here. He never got to live in it. He died within a year of its construction. It then went through various hands. It ended up in the Van Dusen family, whip makers also. They lived in it until the Depression essentially ruined them, and then they moved into the property that they had built next door, the Van Dusen Inn. And that big old house became derelict. You may remember that in the 1936, the Van Dusen Inn burned, the greatest loss of life in Westfield in the Van Dusen Inn fire. The building was semi-derelict until after World War II, and sometime 46, 47, somewhere in there, the building was torn down and the Three Little Pigs were built in its place. This is my last example. This is the biggest private home that was ever built in Westfield. It had depended on how you counted the tower rooms, 28 to 31 rooms. It had 15 formal bedrooms. The dining room had a T-shaped table that seated 31 before the extra leaves were put in. Its parlor drawing room was 32 feet by 19 feet, and it had 2 towers. The front of the property, and you can see there's a long drive going to the property. The front of the property had a big fountain. This home was built by the Thayer family. There originally had been a large home on the property. It was part of the Fowler families. There's a string of Fowler properties that ran all the way from the Little River, where it goes into the Westfield River on the end of Silver Street, all the way to the bridge in Southwick. Fowlers owned all that land through there. They raised tobacco. The Fowlers who lived there did not have any children, and they had a nephew who came down from Pittsfield, and he essentially inherited their property. He married well. He married Hiram Harrison's daughter. She brought the real money into the family, and so he moved the old Fowler home up Broad Street and placed it on a piece of property that is today called Parker Park, where it became a tenement house. And they built this. Lucius, they had, Lucius was the town architect. He supposedly built this church and the second church and a lot of other buildings in town. And this was the most magnificent mansion in Westfield. Some of you heard my talk about the previous celebrations, and I talked about the 1869 celebration that got rained out and that people drifted into town the next day or two. Well, he invited them, he threw his home open, and that's where the celebration was held, was in this home. By the 20th century, the last survivor of the family in town was Mary Thayer. She really could not keep such a property up. And so what they did is they cut this kitchen off, that piece right there, and they moved it to the front of the property, approximately where the drugstore is today. If you want to give the next slide. The original building sat here on Broad Street, and that kitchen was moved to the front. Now, I've had a few people tell me, oh, they remember the Thayer home. It was a great big home. No, what you remember is the kitchen, which was a great big home. Because by 1937, the other home was gone. This home lasted until Mary died, and in 1957, it was knocked down. Now, the interesting thing, for years, I've known about this home being the biggest, most spectacular home in the city of Westfield. We own a couple of photographs of the interior, and it shows these marble fireplaces and paintings. I mean, this was a wealthy family. I've had contact with numerous members, descendants. Those two pictures that you see are the only photographs that seem to exist of that house. The family does not have any. There is a survivor, however. 2 years ago, the fountain was rediscovered in storage. And as part of the Gaslight District in downtown Westfield, the fountain has been re-erected behind School Street, what used to be called the School Street Bistro. It's now called Wings and Things, and it's behind it in their parking lot. And that is the last remnant of this house. They're all gone. Some of them disappeared a long time ago, and some of them quite recently. More of them will be going. I call your attention in particular to one I drive by about every day that I'm tearing my hair out about. It is the house on Silver Street next to Parker Park, kind of across from the junior high school. The great big late 19th century mansion that's there that is deteriorating rapidly. It will be gone before long. The problem with all these homes, and I'm not calling for a public outcry to go save homes. The thing is, these homes are big and expensive to keep up, hard to heat, hard to repair, difficult to live in. Quite often, they exist in places that people with the money to keep them up don't want to live. But there are many still left in Westfield. Look at them, enjoy them, and if you can, encourage the government to do whatever it can with zoning and the rest to help people help preserve them. Thank you very much.